When the Ashanta attacked the Earth was very, very unprepared for what was coming down. The Ashanta came in with their massive ships and began to fire from lunar orbit their mass drivers, dropping much ordnance directly on population centers, focusing primarily on civilians and then focusing on military assets. The only thing that seemed to keep humanity alive was the fact that they were spread so far out above the planet that it was difficult to track all of them. Much of what they fired upon was what they believed to be essential for human survival, and they would simply wait. They would simply wait a couple of planetary rotations around the sun to see if humans surrendered, to see if humans would give up and fall prey to their own animal desires, their own animal instincts. But humanity did not. What they did not understand is that humanity still had the ability to pull together as one, to feed each other, to share amongst each other at least most of the planet. There were still other areas of the planet that tore themselves to pieces as soon as their infrastructure was severely damaged. And this is what the Ashanta wanted. They wanted the humans to rip themselves apart and then cry for help, beg for forgiveness, and then they would simply walk in and take the planet. Hell, the planet would be given to them. But for much of the planet, the humans did not fall prey to their base desires, but instead rebuilt, and rebuilt stronger as they rebuilt massive weapons to aim up towards the sky. They were unable to reach outside their own atmosphere, as each of these attempts were immediately, shall we say, dissuaded by a stray asteroid or some sort of mechanical interference. The opposing force believed that they were being sneaky about this, but it was clear as every single time each of these small shuttles, these rockets, whatever was shot into space, simply would barely clear the magnetic field of the planet and was hit at the exact same height. They were obvious. The humans understood this and sent out a message to the skies. It was a strange message, mostly in binary code, which simply came out to help us. They seemed to be looking for anyone to come in, and the Ashanta simply laughed at this. And as they saw that the humans were gearing up for a fight, they fired again down onto the planet, this time firing 3 times as much ordnance, as it took a long time to build this ordnance by siphoning off all sorts of materials from the asteroid belts. But they wanted the planet, but they did not want to destroy it. They fired at supervolcanoes. They fired at fault lines. They fired at anything that would cause massive destruction, and they succeeded. Many island nations were wiped clean from the tsunamis. Many cities were shaken to the core and simply brought down to Earth from the massive shaking of the tectonic plates. Things like the Madrid fault line shut down half a continent. But humans simply pulled themselves up again by their bootstraps and rebuilt again. This time, there was no playing around. They showed themselves for the first time in decades, and they demanded that the humans surrender. The humans responded with several messages, some of which were difficult for the translations to understand. One simply translated to legumes from trees, and the other one was mate me. It was confusing, but each of these were seen as an act of defiance, as they simply did not surrender. And as the ships finally started to reach towards the planet, they found out that the humans had been preparing well. But the humans did not fare very well, even though they put everything into it. They fired all their ordnance only to see it shot out of the sky. Dummy ordnance seemed to hold out much better, but there was only so much they could put up at that height. These massive ships came down the size of a small city, and if they were to crash, they would cause even more damage. But it didn't matter. The humans continued to fire. Even if they were on the ground, completely outranged, they could be seen on the monitors firing their handheld weapon systems up towards the ships, knowing full well that they weren't doing anything. But then they would simply raise their hand, palm facing themselves with their fist closed, and raise one of their digits. This, they found out, was another act of defiance. With that, bombardments of large swaths of the planet took place. But as these bombardments began, they didn't see what came up behind them. The Legionatus came in, and yes, that is as close as humans can pronounce the name, came in as fast as they could. Their ships not nearly as large, but much, much faster, packing one hell of a main gun, strafing each of the attacking vessels one after another, forcing them to land on the planet as they were no longer space-worthy, no longer airtight. And as they landed on the planet, the humans mauled them. They came at them like an army of angry ants as they crawled up the landing struts, anything to get close to their attackers, anything to take them down. Eventually, the ships themselves repaired themselves enough that they could get off the planet, but only about 60% of them were able to get out before the humans found a way to keep them on the planet. And with that, they were simply sitting ducks for what the humans call artillery. This artillery blasted down onto the hull and began to knock huge holes into the ship itself. And then they would do something absolutely insane. As each of these ships was blown a hole, not only by human weapons, but the Legionatus, as they came through and strafed on the ships, cutting large swaths into the hull, aircraft would fly over. Large cargo aircrafts that didn't seem to have any weapons would open up either side or the back, and humans would jump out using air to slow them down. Large pieces of nylon were opened up above them, and they would simply float down to the ship. The point defense systems that were still operational would fire at them, but they were such small targets it was difficult for the point defense systems to get a lock on, and eventually the humans would get into the ship. And even though not as large as the Ashanta, they definitely fought like one. Seeing that they were finally outgunned, those that had made it off the planet ran back to their own sector. The humans screaming back, "Don't ever come back here!" But plans had already been made. The Legionaris was not a large species, large in the numbers or number of planets that they had, but they had aided humans in a time of their greatest darkness. And this is something that would not be forgotten. 21 years, human years that is, after the Legionatus had protected humanity, they found themselves on the other end of a siege. The Ashanta had also got a hold of Batedas. The Batedas had actually come in with even larger vessels. Though they could not get inside the gravity well, they would send down their shuttles and simply overrun a planet if they wanted to take it. If not, they would use their main guns to simply destroy the planet. But as a show that they were stronger and better, they wanted to defile the Legionatus, quite literally. They would breed them out of existence by killing all the males and taking all the females as slaves. They would do this along with teaching their children they were nothing but a slave race. And as they saw that their planet was going to be overrun, their home planet cried out to the stars, to any of their allies, "Please come and save us." As the planet began to completely fold, several cities were holdouts. Several of these areas were sitting on top of land masses that could not be fired on without destroying the entire planet. This was their only saving grace. This is what they held out for. But they realized the Bolsheviks were coming in, and they would be coming in with such numbers that there was no way they could stop them. Even if they were simply a ground-based fighting force, it didn't matter. they would have so many numbers and so many weapons. They could set up so much crew serve weapons that they'd be able to punch through the walls and eventually just flood in. They simply tried to hold as they could. Their last large stronghold was still there, with walls intact. Walls that both the Ashantas and the Bolsheviks were able to just lay bodies at the base. It was like a flood that crashed up against the walls and failed each time, but eventually they saw that the Bolsheviks had brought in a type of charge, a strange type of charge they had never seen before, something that actually blew through not only their energy protective areas, which was mostly just an EM field that degraded any type of energy weapon, but also was strong enough to take apart the walls that were dozens of meters thick. With horror, they saw the exterior wall blow open. There was now a hole large enough that they could drive entire legions of machines through. And they believed this was when they would see their demise. They prepared themselves mentally for what was going to come. And as the Bolsheviks geared up to move in, they received a word. Their allies were under attack. But from what? They didn't know. Ships had come out of the void, out of nowhere, simply jumped out of FTL and began to fire with reckless abandonment, firing all sorts of ballistic weapons, missiles, torpedoes, railguns, coil guns, point defense cannons, you name it, it was fired. Energy weapons whipped through the night sky. Even as they looked up, the Legionnaires couldn't believe what they were seeing. Streaks of green, blue, red were just ripping apart the sky. They could see when each of the enemy ships were hit as they would blow up with a strange yellow, orange, and green hue. It was almost blue towards the end as the engines would implode on themselves and then burst. They looked up and cheered, thankful for this. The Bolsheviks didn't care. They didn't care that they had lost the space. They still had the ground, and they began their movement forward. But they had no idea what was coming down. The mountainous terrain around the city hid the drop of many shuttles. Many pods were not seen through the night sky. Those that had come were not using fusion engines, and with this were able to hide their descent. And as the day grew, the Bolsheviks got ready and began to move forward in a large mass, keeping themselves together, using their shields to cover their advance. They knew with opening in the wall, they'd be able to get in and take everything out, but they would have to get in a large group to do so. And as they got within about 100 meters, they heard something that scared them to the core. There was a large sound coming out of the distance. They didn't know what it was, but it sounded almost like sound radiating through a brass instrument. They didn't understand the tone, but they simply turned around, and when they did, they saw something they did not believe. There was clouds of dust coming through the forest, coming over the ridgeline, and as it did, it began to come down in some sort of strange flood itself. It was almost as though there was an avalanche. They prepared themselves for falling rocks, but what came after was nothing that they would have expected. It wasn't rocks. It was something much, much more dangerous and something much more determined than just a simple boulder. What they saw were multitudes of vehicles, some of them hovering, kicking up dust as they went, others on tracks, others on 4, 6, or even 8 wheels, as they all charged down towards the lines, each of them with cannons on top, and on top of their vehicles were several of these strange-looking bipeds wrapped in metal armor. They simply only took a moment to figure out that they had just been flanked and coming down the mountains. As they began to raise their weapons to fire, the enemy fired their main cannons, and with that, the Legionnaires couldn't believe what they saw. Off the top of the vehicles, these metal bipeds seemed to have wings, These wings that couldn't retract but simply burst out a flare underneath. And with that, each of these bipeds flew to the sky, all of them holding some strange weapons. And as they got to the arc of their jump, they began to fire down into the lines and rows of their enemies. As they bust through the line, they were barely dodging their own fire from their own machines as they fired down into the crowd. The Bolsheviks broke their lines and simply ran in two different directions, one towards the city and one towards these new winged whatever the hell they were. As they jumped up, as each time the Bolsheviks shot up at them and realized very quickly that the armor that they were wearing was very, very dense. Though the concussive force was enough to knock these bipeds back and make them plummet to the ground with a hard thump, it was not enough to keep them there. They would simply groan, say something unintelligible, and then get up, grabbing their weapon, raising it, and begin fire into the lines. Within moments of the second jump, the entire area was full of projectiles, energy weapons, blades that were vibrating at superhuman speeds. It was absolutely insane. The battle became a melee as the bipeds jumped in and began to extend large blades from their arms and just slashed into the enemy. Those inside the city brought up their own weapons and began to fire on the attackers as best they could, and now the attackers were flanked on both sides. They did not have a way of escaping. And just as any cornered animal, they would fight like hell. But they found very quickly that it doesn't matter what their pride said. It didn't matter what their desperation was. When you're outmatched, you are simply outmatched. They tried to call for assistance from the Ashanta fleet, but the Ashanta fleet had either been torn to ribbons, or the few that remained had run into the void themselves, trying desperately to stay away from whatever in the hell was attacking them. Those that had attacked had said nothing and decided to let their weapons talk for them. Their weapons cut through the hull of most ships, literally slicing them into half, and then just letting them drift. Normally, if it touched the engine compartment, this would cause a reaction meltdown, and the resulting explosion would not only blow the engine compartment, but cause enough force, kinetic force, to push the other part of the ship to one direction so fast that the occupants turned into goo on the side of the walls. The bulkheads now, for the drifting parts, were slick with entrails, which were slowly either freezing or burning in the void of space. On the ground, the Bolsheviks tried desperate, but they were completely outgunned and eventually outmanned. The bipeds they could see now seemed unfazed by anything. It didn't matter if they were knocked down. It didn't matter if they were hit. It didn't matter if they were punctured. It didn't matter if they saw red blood pouring out of them from several different directions. They just continued to fight. There was a few out there that had a strange white stripe on them. These ones did not seem to be combatives, but seemed to be going to aid those that had been injured. It was a choice that they decided to fire on these bipeds, whatever they were. They fired with all the weapons they had, trotting them at all four legs that they could push, trying desperately to at least take down these one creatures that had the white stripe on them. As they got close, they saw there was a strange red mark on that white stripe, and just as one of those with this marking fell, this seemed to enrage the bipeds to no end as they fought even more desperate, more dangerously, and more of the Bolsheviks fell faster and faster. They didn't understand why was this one so important, but their answer would never come. Eventually, everything was quiet. The bipeds simply stopped outside the walls, standing over the bodies of those they had just slaughtered. Their vehicles had stopped as well. And one small contingent of 4 of these bipeds walked up to the Legionaris wall. They walked up close, right to the edge, and then waited for the Legionnaires' captain to come out. The Legionnaires' captain came out on his 4 legs and seemed to give their version of an impromptu salute. They walked up a little bit confused and simply asked, "Who are you and why did you do this?" With that, the one in front simply reached up to its helmet, touched 2 pieces on the side, and there was an audible click on either side. And then a second click. And then it simply raised the helmet off its head and put it under its arm. That is when the Legionnaires realized who and what they were. These were humans. The commander of the humans simply looked at us and through the translator stated, "We owed you. You helped us out before and we've come to repay our debt." Grateful, the Legionnaires' commander almost went up and held him. The commander of the humans stepped back a little bit, confused at the gesture, did not quite understand their whole society. Bringing himself back to professionalism, the Legionnaires' commander simply looked at the humans and said, "This is the same thing that's happening across our planet. Could we possibly get more of your aid to free our people? Plus, we have a lot of wounded civilians here." The human commander grinned a little bit, trying desperately not to show his teeth as he realized this could be seen as a more aggressive gesture, and then simply stated, "Don't worry. We got you, brother."